Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie, and I believe that all readers should read children's literature, especially adults. So that's what we do on the KidLit Love podcast. We celebrate all things children's literature, picture books, early readers, middle grade, and young adult novels too. Whether you're an adult reading to your inner child or connecting the young readers in your lives with fantastic books, you've come to the right place. Each week, we'll talk to a different children's literature author and discuss their books, their hopes and dreams for readers, their writing process, and much, much more. So, grab a notebook to build your TBR, and let's get to today's episode of KidLit Love. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the KidLit Love podcast. I'm Stephanie Affinito, your KidLit loving host, inviting you back to another bookish conversation with a children's literature author. Today, I'm talking with Brian Anderson. Brian is the creator of the nationally syndicated comic strip Dog Eat Doug, along with several other children's books, like The Conjurer's Trilogy and Monster Chefs. He's even partnered with Reading is Fundamental to explore ways comics and graphic novels can help their mission to ensure every child can read. And in fact, he's here today to talk about his newest graphic novel series for middle grade readers. Let's just get right to the conversation. Brian, welcome to KidLit Love. I'm so glad you're here today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, of course. Let's start with introductions. I want to know all the things. I want to know why comics. I want to know how you got to have a nationally syndicated comics strip and how that led into your new middle grade series that we're talking about today. Like spills
Sure.
tea.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I think it wasn't ever a choice. My parents told me I started drawing when I was 2. So it was just something I always did. And so the natural progression was to go into comics. And so that's what I had been pursuing. And when I got out of college, that was when the big crash in comics happened in the 90s. Kind of a similar thing that's happened to publishing recently. So I've been through that before. There was really no work to be done. And a writer at Marvel told me, "Why don't you go do your own stuff? You do all this weird stuff. Go do that." I was like, "Oh, I never thought of that." So yeah, I did. But I was very lucky when I was a kid. We didn't have the money for art school, stuff like that. But my grandmother had saved my dad's comics collection from the 40s and the 50s. So I had access. I knew the Peanuts from the Sunday papers, but he had the first collection of Peanuts from the 1952, I believe. And it's a very different comic. It's very kind of gothic, depressing, angst-ridden. So as a little kid, it was very confusing at first. Like, that's not Peanuts. What is that? But
Right.
that's always stayed with me. And he had a collection of New Yorkers cartoons, which I didn't like, except every few pages there was this really weird one by this guy called Charles Adams. And from like third grade on, I was obsessed with Charles Adams. So that kind of formed my basis of humor and cartooning. Um, but it was much later that I got into it. I was actually, after doing my college strip, I knew I wanted to try for syndication. I was trying to develop 2 separate cartoons, and they want a big commitment, like 10 years. They sign you for like 10 years. And I didn't want to sign for 10 years for either of those comics. And eventually, I started screenwriting. Um, and then one day we got Sophie, our dog, and I was really frustrated and done with these strips that I was working on. And then I went to go play with her, and literally the entire concept popped into my head. I didn't have my son at the time, so I made him up at first, but 2 years later he was born, so it became a documentary basically. Um, and that's what it always was. So yeah, I started it as a web comic. It got syndicated the year later, and then from there I was just putting in. It was real life stuff mixed with their imagination. And then when we adopted our cats, they went in there. Our foster dogs
Yeah.
go in. So it was taking real life, following real life, and just kind of adding the personality of the characters to it. Um, and that's how I basically got into syndication. And it's newspapers. I knew getting in. I'd always had plans to follow in Snoopy's footsteps because I knew newspapers were dying, they were shrinking. So that was always the plan, but what had happened was that industry became any kind of industry that's kind of shrinking and dying. It becomes a not so nice arena to play in. Um, and then after doing the strip for like 15 years, it came down to, you could spend all your money fighting them legally with the stuff that was going on, or you could quit. And I didn't like either option. So I was kind of at a low point, and this is all I had left of my Sophie dog. I had my Fosters and stuff in there, but this is all I had left of her was this comic. I didn't want to give it up. And right at that time, I got a letter from a mom who sent me her son's picture of her son and his dog. He had been inspired by the strip to write his own comic, and he sent it to me.
Wow.
And that's the moment I had gotten letters from young readers, but that was the moment it dawned on me. This kid had never held a newspaper. He doesn't even know what a newspaper is, but he had found the comic through his parents who were fans of the comic. They got him the ebooks that I had put out. So to him, this was just Sophie and Doug and the whole cast. He loved them. And that's when it hit me like, oh, what am I doing? Why am I getting caught up in this side of things?
Yeah.
So I drew up a plan, which was to basically the Snoopy plan, I call it, go into my passion, graphic novels and animation. Drew up the plan. And from that, a year later, the books were already in the works and other stuff was in the works. Um, but it took that low point and then that inspiration from a reader to just say, oh, what are you really trying to do here? Who you forget people read this stuff,
Yeah.
and that was a big reminder. So that was why I was really thrilled that Marvel Press picked these books up because they have the same vision and they're not a big publisher that's just throwing stuff against the wall, seeing what sticks and then backing that. They're like, we're 100% on board with what you're doing. And that's been huge, huge part of it. So yeah, that's how we ended up here.
Wow. So do you know of Alex Banayan?
That sounds familiar for
Yeah,
some reason.
he's written a book called The Third Door. And as you were talking about your story, I kept thinking of that because you said, there's option A and option B, and I didn't like either one of them. And in Alex's book, he talks about like some of the best projects of our time, some of the most inspiring people. They come from people who chose the third door because they didn't like the options and they just went in a back doorway that honored who they were and what they wanted to do and what they hoped to bring to the world. And then it just kind of comes to be. And I just kept thinking, he took the third door. Brian took
Yeah.
the third door.
It was literally that. I mean, it's one of those times where it's going to be a new thing I talk to kids about and stuff too, is that I had never gone through something like that. I've been very fortunate in that I kind of did what every artist does. You get these little breaks here and there. You get syndicated. You do this comic book. You do that. And you think, oh, it just goes from there. Then you forget at some point you have to take command of it and sit down and say, what am I doing here? And even in that dark moment, you got to draw up that plan, figure it out step by step, and then start executing on that plan. And yeah, that came from other like one of my favorite writers now is Jack Carr, who's just a obviously an awesome writer, but he's just a phenomenal human being. And that was also the inspiration too of saying Jack's a better person than me. And if he's saying this stuff and doing, I need to listen to someone like that.
Yeah. Well, and as an educator and someone who pushes as many books as I possibly can into little kids' hands, I can really relate with that moment. I think this is where I think I, as an educator, educators and librarians who are listening, that's where I feel like we're luckier than the authors in that we get to see that reaction
Yeah.
that happens when a child gets that right book in their hands that either sparks a new idea, makes them feel like they are a reader, or shows them that, hey, maybe this is possible for me. Those are the moments that I live for, that so many of us listening to this podcast live for. And I'm so glad you got one so that you kept going in this new area because now like reader after reader after reader will be able to do this after opening up and having such a fun time inside your books.
That's what when I first started doing school visits, I never wanted to be that, I remember writers coming to schools. I never wanted to be that adult talking to children or talking at children. So when I first got invited to schools, it kind of hit me hard. I'm like, whoa, I don't want to, you could just go along, oh, here's my book and it's about this, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I don't want to do that. I'm like, what would I want to know? So my whole focus became taking the mystery out of writing and making stories. So what I taught to or showed to kids, and I do it interactively. So it's not me talking to them. We do it together. They do it in their notebooks and we do a story together. We outline an entire what a story in 20 minutes. And what I'm trying to, the analogy I give the kids is I start off by asking them if they have any parents that are carpenters or contractors, and their parents can build stairs. And I'm like, oh, we all know what stairs look like, right? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, if we went down to Lowe's and bought some power tools and wood, we could probably put together something that looks like a staircase, right? And they're like, oh yeah. I'm like, would any of you want to walk up it? And they're like, no. I'm like, so the analogy is that, yeah, that's the same as making any kind of story. You're not born being able to do it. It's a trade like any other trade. It's no different than being a carpenter. You have to learn how to use power saws. You have to learn, how you measure this, how you deal with that. Even after you build it, how do you fix things that aren't lining up properly? So it's that's my favorite moment is when kids kind of see that they're like, oh, these aren't just magical creatures that can do these things, and I can't do it. I'm never going to be able to. It's a trade. If you want to do it, it's just learning the skills. That's all it is. Yeah, so that's why when you mentioned that, that's always been kind of my goal when I talk to kids.
Yeah. Well, and to have a graphic novel series, again, as an educator, I primarily worked with children who either had a difficult time learning literacy or just weren't all that
Mm.
interested in
Yeah.
reading. But man, that graphic novel, that was different. That was a game changer. That kind of broke the so-called rules, and a lot of kids said, like, this is fun. This is a
Yeah.
story. This is a cartoon. This is a movie in my head. And so I feel like even more, your books have the potential to reach students in an entirely second layer, which is these are fun, inviting books that I kind of call, and maybe this sounds bad and maybe it doesn't, but graphic novels are kind of like the gateway, the gateway
I
drug to
was
books.
Yeah. I used to say that to parents because, when they'd always ask, "What do you do with a reluctant reader?" And now I change. I always used to say comics are a gateway to reading, but now I just say comics are as good as reading anything else.
That's right.
The whole key is to find out what they want to read. And the way to do that is expose them to everything. They might like history books. They might like biographies. You don't know. I know people, I don't understand it, but they don't like fiction. But that's fascinating to me. It's
Yeah.
the same with kids. We forget kids might not like that, but they might like something on the Civil War. Who knows? Um, but the key with comics and graphic novels, I was lucky that I was exposed to it young. I stumbled on the Sandman in seventh grade. Neil Gaiman's The Sandman. And that blew me out of the water because I loved books. I was lucky I loved books, but to me, that was better than I'm like, this is better than most books I'm reading. I want more of this.
Yeah.
And that's the same with kids. So if they get exposed to um, just trying out all different kinds of books, but comics are great because the visual aspect of it, they get access right away in their minds to the characters. You don't lose them with prologue. You don't lose them with too much description and, oh, I don't want to suffer through this and I don't like this. Right away, you can grab their attention and they're hooked and they're reading,
Yes.
you know?
And I don't think they realize the amount of so-called work that they're doing, because
Yeah.
using those pictures for information, that's inferencing and predicting and deep thinking and inferring the character's emotions and the action on the page. There's just as much cognitive effort, right, that goes into a
Yeah.
graphic novel than a so-called typical book. And so
Yeah.
I love that we can give that to kids, as you said, and just see what they like. See what they like and kind of give them what they want accordingly so that they do keep reading whatever it is they love to read.
Yeah, that's why I tell parents too, like, I'm like, "Your kids like movies, right?" I'm like they're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Yeah, well, guess what? Most of those movies you see, almost 90% of them are based on comics,
Yeah.
and the comics are better. Very few movies succeed in doing what was in the comics. That's why I always tell kids, "You like that new Batman movie? Well, that was based on The Long Halloween by Tim Sale. Go
Yeah.
read that, and if you like that Batman movie, the new one, which I love, but go read The Long Halloween and it'll blow you out of the water. You'll be like, "Whoa, they don't know what they're doing with these movies." As good as the movies are,
Yeah,
so that's another in with kids too that are reluctant readers,
yeah,
is if they like stuff like that, they'll discover this stuff that it's based on is even better.
yeah. So let's talk about your new series. There are 2 books that have just come out about a week or so ago in the Sophie series. We have Jurassic Park and Frankenstein's Hound. These are bright, they are colorful, they are exciting, there is action, there is movement, there's imagination. As a dog lover and a reader, I loved both of them. I would love for you to tell listeners a little bit about the series and your opening 2 books in them, for those that haven't been able to get a hold of them yet since they were literally just released.
Yeah, that's the fun part. Excuse me, especially if they're not familiar with the comic strip, I'm very excited about those readers too, because my approach, luckily I've been writing these characters for 15 years, so that wasn't a challenge. I know what the characters are and how to stay true to them, and I have a great editor that helps me do that. Um, the key to me, especially with any audience, is there's a lot of, writing to children what you want them to learn. And that's never been my approach. This is literally, I mean, these books are dog centric. These are based on my real life dogs and foster dogs. Everything that happens makes its way into the books. Um, in the first one, there's Sophie teaching Doug how to be cute, to get what you want. The
I
parents aren't
love
really in control, and he's going to show Doug the baby. This is what you do. This is how you get your way. But then that's the reality that you see as a parent, with dogs, with kids. But in the books, you get to have this fun experience where it goes totally wrong, and Doug takes it too far, and the world just becomes overly cute in a kind of apocalyptic way. Um, that's kind of the fun. And the other fun thing I love about it is that it's also for the parents. That's the number one compliment I love getting from readers. I get it all the time. I never get tired of it. Is they say, "Do you have cameras in our house?" Um, I never wanted to make something that you just hand to a kid just to, ugh, go read this and it's disposable. I always wanted something like the comic strip, but at a more profound level where parents can read it with their kids and they'll enjoy it as much as jokes in there just for the parents. You know, in the fourth book, which I'm working on now, it opens with a Game of Thrones reference. It's Sophie on the wall, on the ice wall. So kids, they don't know what Game of Thrones is, but they like the action and Sophie on the wall and all that. But the parents are getting that kind of Pixar reaction of, "Oh, that's for me. I
Yeah,
get it." Yeah. And it's also the kid is the young reader is experiencing because Sophie's going through what they're going through, and the parents experience it from the parents in the book. They're raising these characters.
yeah,
Um, so you get this kind of interesting dichotomy that you can play with, which I love, and that's why I love getting that kind of feedback from parents.
yeah. Well, and here on this podcast, I believe that we should be reading children's literature
Oh
all the way
yeah,
through, whether we have kids or not. So it is perfect that it has that. I loved the back and forth from kind of reality to the not reality. That back and forth, just it made it a very quick page turning kind of read. You had a
yeah,
lot of fun, yet that relatableness of the reality of it. I'm curious, how did you go from kind of thinking, what's the best way to say it? I guess short form, maybe
yeah,
comics, to a much longer graphic novel with chapters, which is always appealing to kids too. Not all graphic novels have labeled chapters, and this one does.
yeah. Um, it was easy and challenging at the same time. In the comic strip, I was always struggling because I always was trying to break out of that four panel and do longer stories. So some of the Indiana Lab, that kind of stuff was in the comic strip, but you always had to have that punchline at the end.
Yeah.
And I never wanted to fall into that drum roll, boom, boom joke kind of gag strip. So
Mhm.
that was always, but when I got to the graphic novels, now I could sit back and I could see what's Sophie's. journey, and her journey is the same as a little kid. She's, in the first one, is dealing with jealousy. Um, then it was just a matter of letting her run wild and seeing all these adventures happen, and then placing that in kind of an order. But you'll see in the first one, it does still have that comic strip rhythm. There's more jokey joke on the end of each page, and then it slowly, as like you can see where my I got more comfortable and opened up. Um, Ended up being a good thing because in the first book it gets people going quicker, but then the storylines open up. Um, so you get to play more with what's happening to Sophie, how she's reacting to these situations, um, and then you can kind of work the jokes in from the characters. They come from the characters, from the situation,
Yeah.
which is more fun than trying to force a joke into four panels. It's more natural. It feels more alive.
Yeah.
The comic strip. Um, so yeah, that was the biggest challenge, and I was lucky that my editor, Michael knows the comic strip really well and Sophie really well. So he'd always like, Sophie would never do that, and I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. I would get so excited that I could do these wild, bigger adventures,
Right.
and then he's like, Sophie's not being Sophie. I'm like, oh yeah, you're right. So then you go back and you got to remember, you got to let her be herself.
Yeah.
So, yeah. So there was a lot of that in the first 2 books going back and forth on that.
So you mentioned that most of what you created the comics around and in this book were actual either events or happenings or things from your actual dog life, from your life. So as you kind of conceptualize these books, I'm just curious in terms of process how it works. Is it you remember, you have a certain aspect of your life that you want to put in the book, and then do you sketch it, or are you just sketching something and then you think, "Oh, that would be good." I'm wondering how all of those elements come together from the situation in your real life to the illustrations to the words. How does that process look for you?
It's disciplined and chaotic at the same time. Like, I tell kids to do this, I always tell kids, "Carry a notebook with you everywhere, small notebook."
Yes.
I hate cargo pants, but I started wearing cargo pants so I could fit a little notebook in my pants because that was the only
Oh,
way you could
I
keep
love
it.
it. I love
Yeah,
it.
you don't know when an idea is gonna strike, and when it does, you're not gonna remember it 5 minutes later. You gotta get it down. So everything I write is all longhand. Even the novels, I write longhand first.
Wow.
And I'll write and I'll also sketch at the same time because you're literally, like I tell kids, it's like a movie in your head. So it doesn't matter if you're writing or drawing, you're capturing what you're seeing and what's happening. And you're just trying to get to the root of the story, the root of the character. So with the comics, yeah, it's basically just all in a notebook. It's writing, a lot of times it's having an idea you want to do and you're writing that, but then you start doodling the characters and they do something completely different. And so it surprises you too. That's kind of when you know you're on the right track, when you can't force it, what you want to have happen. Um, so it's a constant, always sketching, always drawing, observing what dogs do, how they behave, how they interact with other dogs. Um, that's how the fence analogy comes up in the comic strip and in the graphic novels. Was, how dogs behave at a fence when other dogs go by. So a lot of the conversations and Sophie has with dogs walking by came from that, how they see that wall. And it kind of represents other bigger things. It's a metaphor in a sense, but it all spawns from how dogs react to each other, how they interact with kids. And then you just kind of let that, play out. So for like one example, we had a foster who was had severe human shyness to the point where she would become catatonic, paralyzed, and pee anytime you went near her. I mean,
Yeah.
it was brutal. So I assume she was never going to get adopted, but she's in book 3. I think she's in book 3, Luna. But so it would be a heart wrenching story to just have that happen. So then it becomes, how do you work something that's really tragic and hard to deal with in real life into a comic strip and not be preachy about it. Oh, this is how we need to treat dog. So it became this dog coming home in a funny scene where you don't even see the dog for at first because she's so scared she won't even come in the door. So you get a lot of gags out of that.
Yeah.
then it's her hiding under furniture, so you still haven't seen her. So you're kinda building this, getting the
Yeah.
kids excited they haven't seen her yet. And then it's Sophie trying to take her on one of her Bat Lab adventures, trying to make her a superhero, which goes horrifically wrong because the dog is obviously, terrified. Um, so that's kinda how you do it. You let the characters handle it. You say, "Here's the situation. What are you gonna do with it?" And then you just watch in your head how it goes along.
Yeah.
Um, and that way it doesn't come off as preachy to kids about, trying to preach about foster dogs and stuff like that. They're just seeing the dogs and the characters as people with problems similar to theirs, anxiety, things like that. And then you kinda handle it with humor and heart at the same time. And that can be a tricky thing to balance too.
It sure can. It sure
Yeah,
can. The big problems of the world, kids, they know them, they experience them, but like you said, how and where do you bring them into books? But at the same time, have what's happening in the books be metaphors to consider for ways the world works. It's such a balance that I admire you authors for, and I really can appreciate how you said like there's a little bit of everything moving in all directions, and when you're on the right track when it kind of, I don't want to say gets away from you, but it starts to take on a life on its own.
yeah,
I find that process from a reader's point of view just fascinating when I hear authors say that. Like, oh, I didn't know the character was going to do that
yeah,
until she did. I
yeah.
just
That's what
love it.
you have to push for that because otherwise it's you forcing and you see this in a lot of children's books, is they're forcing what they want the children to learn on the kids.
Yeah.
Kids will turn on those books 100% of the time because
Yeah.
they see it. They're the toughest audience to write for, to perform for, because they can see through that. They can detect it right away.
Yeah.
Which is why, Where the Wild Things Are was such a wildly popular books. Parents didn't want it in the house, but
Yeah.
kids could not get enough of it because it was honest,
Yeah.
you know? That's what you're shooting for, you
Yeah.
know?
So you've mentioned already book 3 and book 4. So I'm really glad to know that there are more coming. We get to get introduced to new dogs, and you've also mentioned foster foster dogs. Tell me a little bit about that. How and why that comes to play an important role in the books.
We started as soon as we moved down here to North Carolina probably 15 years ago now, and the first thing we did when we got down here was started fostering. Um, so it just becomes part of your life.
Mhm.
Um, and it's one of those things where my approach to it was there's some heart-wrenching dark sides to fostering and to the rescue industry as a whole. There's a lot of people getting into it when they want to make themselves feel good, and then when they're feeling better, the dogs get
Yeah.
become secondary. My approach was simple. Every dog that came in the house was going to be my dog. I assumed they weren't going to get adopted, so I treated them like they were my dog. Um, and the other thing I said, I would never give up on a dog, would not quit on a dog. So that's where Annie's story came in. Um, and that was a story I told on my blog. And, Annie became one of the most popular characters I'd ever created. And it was kind of wild. She's in the second book. But the real story was heart wrenching. Um, and it was a tough one to try to, some of it's in the book, some of it's not because it was too hard. We had a dog that I had another dog that came in, two sisters. They weren't supposed to make it through the night. Um,
Mm.
they were considered bite risks. They were, the rescue had given up on them. They didn't tell us that they were going to put them down. They just wanted to see what would happen.
Right.
And I had some issues with her and Annie, and I told the rescue, let's just move Annie somewhere else for now, because I was planning on adopting her, and I'll work with Wheezy. And they said, no, we're putting Wheezy down. And I said, no, that's not how this works. That's not what we're doing this for. So at the end of the day, I had to get another rescue involved to make sure Annie was going to be put somewhere safe and they weren't going to just dump her or put her down. And I signed over legal rights to Wheezy so that they weren't liable for Wheezy. Um, and now if you met Wheezy, you would never guess in a million years that she was, yeah, never. But so when that stuff happens, you can't exactly put the dog fights and the bad stuff that happens. So you have to process it longer and figure out how to get it into the books. How do you deal with that? What are you actually dealing with? It's different kinds of behavioral issues. So um, I think that's why Annie's story in the comics and now in the books will hits home so much, because of Annie's character. That's literally that cartoon of her, how she is in the books is what she was in real life.
Right.
Um, so yeah, when you have like and the same with the cats, I was deathly allergic to cats when we rescued them, and
Okay.
now I can't imagine the books and the stories without the cats.
Yeah.
They're super super popular. Um, so yeah, sometimes it's you have to process what happens in real life longer before you can work it into the stories.
Mhm.
So yeah.
It's almost therapeutic, it feels like.
Yeah, in some ways it is because you do sometimes stop writing and have to just sit back and kind of think on it, and it reminds you of why you're doing what you're doing. um,
Yeah.
it's not just a matter of cranking out content.
Right. Right. Although I do wanna ask you in that cranking out content kind of vein, when is book 3 and 4? Do we have an anticipated date for those?
Yeah, book three is done, so that'll be out next year.
Okay.
Um, I'm not certain of the time yet. It might be spring, and then book four might be out later next year. So
So not too long to wait at all.
no, no, we're gonna keep it going, moving pretty quickly. In the meantime, too, I'm post the strips constantly online so people can read more. I've got 15 years worth of strips, so there's a lot to read in between. So we might do something with those too, to get out there to readers for free, just so they can keep reading more about Sophie.
Yeah. How do you now this is from someone who, has difficulty drawing a stick figure that looks adorable. So this question may seem silly to you, but how how do you draw so voluminously? You've kept yourself to a schedule. You've been cranking out content. How do you manage to do that, to have 4 books coming in the series? Is it just so natural to you that it's just it's what I do. It just comes out so quickly?
Yeah, part of it's from doing it for a long time and always working on the trade of it.
Yeah,
Remembering that it's a trade, it's a skill. You've got to always sharpen your skills. Just like an electrician, they can't fall behind on, if there's a new HVAC unit out and it's got different circuits in it, you can't fall behind. So you've always got to be, so I'm always doing life drawing, sketching. It's helpful having dogs and cats around. So you just draw them constantly.
yeah,
Um, it's learning from other artists, seeing what they do. How do they get so good at what they do? Practicing constantly. And it's learning to deal with the frustrations of it not coming out the way you want it, and dealing with that perfectionism of learning you got to get this done. It's not going to be perfect. I would
hard.
redraw book one of Sophie till I die. I mean, I could it
Yeah,
would never get done if you let me keep doing it. So
right.
deadlines help. Giving yourself deadlines really helps. But yeah, it's just always working on the craft,
Yeah,
and never you fall into these ruts where you're just kind of doing the process and you realize, hey, I need to improve something. I need to learn to draw this type of dog better. So I'll go look at those types of dogs and just draw them for a
yeah,
few days or whatever. And that's why I say carry the notebook with you everywhere. Always be sketching from real drawing from real life is most important. Um,
yeah.
Tracing is another great way. A lot of people frown upon tracing, just like they always frown upon comics. But tracing is a phenomenal way to train your brain how to draw.
Right.
Yeah, so that's a great way. And the other thing I do when I do get frustrated, I read this in a Tim Burton interview. When he would get frustrated, he would switch hands. He would draw with his other hand because his brain realized, "Oh, yeah, what you're drawing is supposed to be bad because that's not your proper hand." So his inner critic would just shut off.
Yes.
Yeah. And you also get cooler drawings because it's you're not trying to get to where you're going somewhere
Right.
weird, different. So I do that a lot. Do that an awful lot.
I love that. I would not have thought about that. That's a great idea, and really a
Yeah,
metaphor for whatever you're working on is to
yeah.
just switch it up a bit, to let go of that perfectionism so you can keep moving forward.
It's learning how to retrain, constantly retrain your brain,
Yeah.
uh, to learn these new schools. Some of that, having a martial arts background helps with that because you learn the hard way that there's going to be pain involved,
Yeah.
but you want to go do the fun thing, but you've got to drill. You
Yeah.
have to. You just have to do it, and it's the only way you're going to improve. So you learn to do the uncomfortable thing.
Yeah. And I loved how you snuck in there that notebook reference again. I'm a huge notebooker. I've got a bazillion of them all over the place. And you wear cargo pants, so your notebook fills in, but my purse size has to accommodate the current
Yeah.
notebook that I love to carry around. So I can relate.
It's frustrating because I don't like drawing on small notebooks, but they're handier. So you just kind of learn how to do that. Do a
Yeah.
shorthand method of just getting ideas down quick, and then you can move over to a bigger notebook when you get home. You know,
Yeah.
you
And
make it
what
work.
another good tidbit or a lesson to pass along to kids, right? You
Yeah,
want to do that too.
yeah,
It's keep your ideas, keep them close, and then later you can expand on them in whatever way feels good to them. Yeah, I love it.
because the stuff they learn as a kid, those things you learn how to get to, these skills. That's not going to change much once you're doing it later on. There's no like big secret that someone reveals to you later on. You realize, oh, the stuff you were doing as a kid to improve is just you're gonna be doing the same thing. It's
Yeah.
the same. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. I feel like you've given us a story about how you came to be in this middle grade graphic novel world. I feel like we got to know your series, and I feel like we got, some important life lessons of people who want to do some sort of creative work of it is possible, and you just have to stay in it and keep learning and love it and do it every day. I feel like that's just a good metaphor for anything that anybody's working.
Yeah. It's persistence will always replace talent. It'll
Mm,
always be talent, and that's something that's a hard lesson to learn as a kid too.
yeah.
But I think that's why, if you're doing sports as a kid, or like in my case, when I did martial arts for most of my life, there's gonna be that person that you can train the same way, but you're never gonna be as good as them. But you can still get to your destination by being persistent, you
Yeah.
know? But yeah, it's a hard lesson to learn, but the earlier you learn that, the better off you'll be.
Yes. Yes. Completely agree. Oh, well, I've loved our conversation. We've gone in lots of different directions and I loved all of them. Where can listeners find you online, on social media, so they can keep up with kind of new projects that you might have coming or anything else that they'd want to connect with you over?
Yeah, so the main sites, I have one site and there's a bunch of URLs that go to. So if you go to brianandersonwriter.com, doggydoug.com, theconjures.com, they all go to the same website.
Okay.
My handle on Instagram is doggydougcomics, and that's mostly I'm posting the comic strips. So you can read a bunch of strips on Instagram, or you can read them on my website too.
Okay. I'll be sure to put links to those in the show notes, as well as links, of course, to your books so that listeners can click on them easily and take a look.
Cool. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was such a fun conversation. I
Thank you for
really
having me. Yeah.
appreciate it. Yeah,
Hopefully I didn't blather on too long.
not at all. I loved it. Thank you. And listeners, thank you for listening to another episode of KidLit Love, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for listening to today's episode of the KidLit Love podcast. You'll find links to all the books, resources, and ideas mentioned in the show notes at alitlife.com. And if you want more, you might like to listen to my other podcast called Get Literate. It's a podcast that explores all things books and reading, notebooks and writing, and everything in between to build a life you love. One more thing. If you love what you listened to today, please take a moment to rate and review the podcast or take a screenshot of the episode and text it to a bookish friend. This helps the podcast grow and builds our bookish community of Kid Lit Love. Thanks for listening.